Matthew wiped the sweat from his brow, the scent of damp hay and aged leather filling his lungs. The horse, Shadowmere, stood in his stall, his once powerful frame now weakened. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, his usually sharp eyes dull. Something was wrong, and Matthew knew it was an illness. Lord Richard had noticed too. He had asked Matthew to keep an eye on Shadowmere, but the nobleman was too preoccupied to investigate further. His duties kept him away, leaving Matthew alone with his suspicions. Horses didn't fall into such states overnight, nor without cause. It was late when Matthew first heard it, soft whispers floating through the corridors, a hushed voice mixing with a woman's laughter. He froze outside the stable, recognizing the familiar melody of Lady Eleanor's tone. The other voice was deeper, unfamiliar. He stepped back into the shadows, heart pounding. Shadowmere let out a nervous whinny, shifting in place, ears flicking toward the manor. The horse knew something Matthew did not, his unease mirroring the servant's own growing discomfort. He forced himself to move, walking back toward the house with slow, measured steps. The laughter continued behind closed doors, the murmurs growing softer. A door creaked shut. Silence followed. Matthew didn't sleep that night. He lay on his cot in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant howl of the wind. He thought about the whispers, the laughter, the way Shadowmere reacted. It gnawed at him like a blade pressing against his ribs. By morning, the unease had not faded. The nobleman left early, his boots echoing against the stone floors. Lady Eleanor watched from the window, her posture poised yet stiff. As soon as Lord Richard was gone, she turned, disappearing into the depths of the manor. Matthew busied himself in the stable, but his mind wandered. Shadowmere refused to eat. He paced the stall, snorting softly, eyes darting toward the manor as if expecting something. Or someone. The day passed slowly. Evening fell. Matthew finished his duties and lingered near the stable door. He wasn't sure why. Some unspoken instinct told him to wait. The sky was dark when he saw movement near the entrance of the estate. A figure approached, wrapped in a heavy cloak. Not a servant. Not the master. The man entered without hesitation. Lady Eleanor was waiting. Shadowmere reacted first, rearing slightly, nostrils flaring. The horse knew before Matthew fully registered it. The pieces fell into place. He clenched his fists, stepping back into the shadows. His heart pounded as the truth settled in. Lord Richard's wife had a lover. And now Matthew knew. Matthew worked in silence, his hands moving through routine motions, but his mind refused to rest. He had no proof beyond whispers in the dark and a horse's unease, yet something inside him refused to let it go. Lady Eleanor moved differently now. He noticed the way she smoothed her dress before disappearing into the corridors, how she lingered by the window before Lord Richard's departure, how her gaze flicked toward the entrance, as if expecting someone. Days passed, and Shadowmere's condition worsened. He refused to be saddled, shied away from certain corners of the stable, and his appetite dwindled. The animal sensed something unnatural, something Matthew couldn't ignore. Then the man came again. This time, Matthew watched from the stables, concealed by the shadows of the wooden beams. The stranger arrived under the cover of night, his movements too practiced, too confident. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He belonged. Lady Eleanor was waiting for him, dressed in a way she never did in the daylight. A subtle shift, but Matthew noticed. The way she touched her hair, the way she reached for him before they disappeared behind closed doors. Shadowmere snorted, shifting uneasily in his stall. The horse knew. The horse had always known. Matthew clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. It wasn't his place. A servant did not interfere. He repeated the words in his mind, yet they held no weight. Morning came, and Lord Richard returned. He greeted his wife as he always did, pressing a polite kiss to her cheek. She smiled, but Matthew saw it for what it was, practiced. Hollow. Lord Richard strode toward the stables, brow furrowed. Still no improvement? Matthew shook his head. No, my lord. He grows worse at night. The nobleman sighed, running a hand over the horse's mane. Strange. He was always the strongest of my lot. Matthew hesitated before speaking. Horses, they sense things we don't. Lord Richard gave him a look, half amused, half distracted. Superstition, Matthew? The servant forced a nod, saying nothing more. That night, Matthew waited. He needed more. Needed to see it unfold without doubt. The stranger came as expected. He moved with the ease of a man who had walked those halls too many times before. Lady Eleanor led him inside. The doors closed, and Shadowmere let out a sound Matthew had never heard before, a deep, sorrowful cry, a noise that spoke of something broken. The truth was now undeniable. Matthew moved through the morning with a weight pressing on his chest. The truth sat between his ribs like a lodged dagger. He saw the way Lady Eleanor carried herself, untouched by guilt, her demeanor unchanged. Lord Richard remained blind, lost in the illusion of his household's perfection. Shadowmere stood motionless in his stall, head lowered, his once powerful body now a mere shell of what it had been. He did not react when Matthew approached, nor when the stable doors creaked open. The fight in him was gone. Days passed in a cycle Matthew could not escape. Lord Richard left early, Lady Eleanor watched from the window, and the stranger arrived at night. Each visit carried the same weight, the same stolen touches and whispers behind closed doors. Matthew did not need to hear the words to know what was spoken. He debated speaking up. But servants did not meddle. He had no place to question nobility, no proof beyond what his own eyes had seen. Yet Shadowmere reacted as he did for a reason. The horse's suffering had begun the moment the betrayal had taken root. One evening, Matthew let his frustration slip. He stood before Lady Eleanor as she passed through the corridors, her perfume lingering in the air. "Shadowmere weakens each night," he said, voice measured. "It is unlike him." She barely slowed her step. "Then perhaps he is not as strong as you once thought." Matthew's fingers curled against his palm. "Or perhaps he simply knows too much." She stopped then, only for a breath. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but Matthew saw it. The slight shift in her expression, the flicker of something in her eyes. A warning. A reminder that silence was expected. She walked away without another word. That night, Matthew remained in the shadows of the stable, waiting. The storm outside howled, the wind rattling the wooden beams. Shadowmere paced, ears flicking toward the manor. He knew what was coming. Then footsteps. The stranger arrived, his cloak billowing in the wind before the door shut behind him. Lady Eleanor was there, pulling him close, leading him away. Matthew exhaled slowly, the truth no longer a question but an undeniable fact. The house he served was built on a lie, and the only ones who knew were a servant, a broken horse, and the woman who did not care who suffered so long as she remained untouched. Matthew barely slept. The weight of silence had become unbearable. Every night, the truth repeated itself. Whispers in the dark, stolen moments behind locked doors, and a horse that bore witness to it all. Shadowmere was no longer just sick. He was a reflection of what this house had become. The storm had not passed by morning. The sky remained dark, the air heavy with an impending downpour. Lord Richard stood in the courtyard, adjusting his riding gloves, his gaze drifting toward the stables. Matthew hesitated before speaking. "Shadowmere will not ride today, my lord." Lord Richard frowned. "Still weak?" Matthew nodded. "He grows restless when night falls." The nobleman exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Strange creature. I will ride another." He turned toward the manor, where Lady Eleanor stood beneath the archway, watching. Her expression was unreadable, her posture poised, as if she had not spent the night in another man's arms. Lord Richard did not notice. He only saw his wife, as he had always seen her. Matthew forced himself to look away. He could not bear to watch the lie continue. Night fell with a slow, suffocating weight. The house was still, but Matthew knew what was coming. He remained near the stable, listening to the wind whistle through the wooden beams. Then footsteps. The same pattern, the same quiet arrival. The stranger moved with confidence, unbothered by the storm. Matthew knew the path he took without needing to see it. But this time, another sound followed. A door creaked open. Not hers. Matthew stepped forward, breath caught in his throat. From across the courtyard, a figure moved. Not the stranger. Lord Richard. Matthew barely had time to react before the shouting began. The storm swallowed their words, but the meaning was clear. A crash echoed through the halls, followed by the shattering of glass. Then silence. The manor remained still, the night stretching unbearably long. Matthew did not move until the heavy steps of Lord Richard sounded again, this time alone. The nobleman passed the stables without a glance, his face unreadable, his hands stained with something darker than rain. Shadowmere let out a deep, shuddering breath. By morning, Lady Eleanor was gone. No one spoke her name. The house continued as it always had, but the silence had changed. Lord Richard did not ask about his wife, and Matthew did not ask what had happened. Shadowmere never fully recovered. He ate, he moved, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed, like a creature that had seen too much and could never unsee it. Matthew understood. Some things, once known, could never be undone.